First of all, I would like to greet you warmly on my behalf and on behalf of the Ministry of Labor, Family, Social Affairs and Equal Opportunities. Thank you for inviting me today to this event. Social inclusion, being part of the community and belonging, is a basic need of us all, especially children. Children with various barriers already have problems with integration. But if due to their barriers faced by institutions are further emphasized by this exclusion, institutions in our country are often distanced from urban environments, which makes it difficult for children living in these institutions to access the rights, opportunities, and resources available in the wider community and society. Children with disabilities belong to the group of people of great risk of social exclusion in the world. At our ministry, we are aware of the importance of community care. That is why we support programs that would enable children and young adults with disabilities living in the community, as this is a primary form of living. All other options, such as institutional care in the extreme phase, should only come into place when the child's home environment, with all the professional support available, can no longer provide adequate help and care. We are intending funds from the European Social Fund for development of community programs and services for all groups of population, while we are investing funds from European Regional Development Fund in the establishment of infrastructure for the accommodation of people with disabilities in the community. Part of the funds, in the amount of 7.3 million, is intended for the transformation of CUDV Črna na Koroškem. As part of the project, CUDV Črna employees, with the support of our Institute of Social Protection, employees are being educated and trained in community care, updating their working methods, establishing a new organizational structure in the institutions, raising public awareness, and establishing cooperation with the community, all while establishing accommodations units in the community for 70 users. Thus, the care of children and adults who do not live in their primary family or in another family will be forced on the individual needs and desires, so they can prepare, train for independent living or living with support in the adult life. We also want to bring care and support to people with disabilities in their home environment. This pilot project will serve as a foundation for the transformation of other institutions as well, as we all agree that the transformation from institutional to community-based care is a necessity. At this point, I would like to give the stage to Ms. Barbara Kobal-Tomc, Director of the Institute of Social Protection of Republic of Slovenia. Thank you for the invitation once again.
Thank you, Andrej. Thank you, Jasna. Thank you all for your attention. I would like to say hello also on my behalf and on behalf of the Social Protection Institute of Republic of Slovenia. The topic of today's meeting is extremely important, as the field of child education is one of the key social issues to which citizens, experts, and politicians pay a lot of attention and time. But some topics are often neglected and ignored. This is especially true for children with disabilities, where we can assess the desired progress has not yet been made toward inclusion in the community and personalized support. Unfortunately, we can say that institutions in Slovenia are still the answer that the state and experts used to help and educate children with disabilities, which their families cannot take care or without support. Although institutions provide a basic form of care, they are not really similar to the family environment and have negative consequences for children's development and opportunities. Institutions cannot adequately create the contact and support of parents and meet the needs of the child. They distance children from their parents and from the community, because with their organizational routine and rules, they raise them primarily to live in an institution and not to live in a community. This is why it is most often the case that children living in an institution grow up to be adults living in an institution. With appropriate community care and alternative solutions, the care for children can be more inclusive and adapted to the individual needs for children. In the field of education of children with disabilities, we in Slovenia have taken the first steps toward enabling children with disabilities to attend regular schools. Nevertheless, we still have a lot of work to do to be able to talk about inclusive education. Unfortunately, too many children with disabilities cannot go to the same schools and classes as other children, as appropriate conditions and support are not available. Community schools remain inaccessible to all children due to both systemic and individual barriers. The process of deinstitutionalization, or let's say DI, has been going on in Slovenia for more than 3 decades. In the past, we have taken the first steps in the direction of including children with disabilities into the community, but it would be necessary to address the field holistically and at systemic level. Past and current projects in the field of DI are focused mainly on adults and less on children, which needs to be changed. I believe that Slovenia has the knowledge and potential to make key changes in the future, in the inclusive education and support for children and the establishment of conditions for them to receive appropriate care in the community. I believe that today's event will contribute to the desired and necessary changes. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Now I will pass the floor to Dr. Andreja Rafaelič, also from the Social Protection Institute of the Republic of Slovenia. Andreja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jasna, and thank you to Andreja and Barbara for this introduction. I was asked by Katarina and my other colleagues to present a bit about the situation of children, especially children with disabilities in Slovenia. And an important point I wanted to make first is that Slovenia is a country where we respect children and childhood very much. We have a really good standards of childcare, kindergartens, and so on and on. So this is it has always been an important topic for Slovenia and the development here, both in childcare and social care. One topic that has been neglected in the past few years, it's probably the childcare of children with disabilities or childcare or care of children who live with psychosocial disabilities in educational institutions. But it hasn't been like that since always. So the institutionalization for children in Slovenia, it's not a new topic. Already in 1967, it has started in Logatec, in an institution for children in conflict with law or behavioral issues, where the first experiment happened in this development, meaning that they started to promote permissive and democratic education. They've changed the relationship between the teachers, how they call them, and the children and so on. And the first group homes started being created. So children were put into more family-like environments. Following the, of course, the Logatec experiment got to its natural barriers, because if you really want to implement democratic relationship between children and adults, taking care of them, you cannot stay within the walls of the institution. So it has stopped because there was no possibility, or the social policy situation was not ready to really open up the institution. But following lots of engaged social care professional, but also educational professionals in the 80s, the reform of childcare institutions started. And that ended up in 3 institutions being totally converted into group homes. What we can notice, for example, Nove Jarše, now it used to be a long-term institution for children, and now it's a production center, and it runs group homes for children without disabilities. Also, when in this reform of institutions for children, developed and enhanced the importance of foster care. So compared to the other countries at that time, both in the Soviet bloc, but also in the former Yugoslavian countries, Slovenia was the first country to really develop foster care, to close down orphanages and so on. So no child younger than the age of 3 has been institutionalized, and most children were and are still placed in foster care or community-based settings instead of institutions. Also, what is an important feature of that time, that this was not a action or an adventure of only one sector, like let's say like education sector or social sector, but it was a joint action from the judges were involved, social work centers for social work were involved, schools were involved, and institutions, and they all together, with the support of the politicians and policy, implemented this big reform, which ended up in the situation in the Slovenian institutions for children to improve a lot, and also in developing community services. But unfortunately, this never got to an end. So we did never manage to totally reform the institutional system for children. So what stayed there is this core of institutions where children with more intensive needs are placed there. And this means that the community group homes and settings can have a high threshold. So not every child or children with more complex lives and needs are usually not placed in the community group homes, but more likely to be placed in institutions. So quite often we don't provide enough support to foster families in order for them to be able to take care of their foster children until the age of 18, but they're quite often, when the situation gets too complex or too hard, in this situation that they have to place the foster child in the institutions. Also, what we can notice, if in the adult care in Slovenia we have developed NGOs who develop services and so on, the services for children and coordinated care for children in the community was never developed. It has always, we have very few non-governmental organizations who advocate for children and who provide services to children. After this first attempt, now it seems at the moment that the coordination and collaboration between all these actors who are involved in childcare, so let's say families and centers for social work, schools and institutions, but also on the policy level, we can see that this collaboration and coordination is not strong anymore, probably because there has not been big developments and reform going forward. And another important point is that social inclusion in schools is a policy in Slovenia, and then we have a law who prescribes it and regulates it. But we quite often can see that it did not really change the situation for children with intensive needs. We can see that children who were already in ordinary schools, now finally they can get support to be able to attend mainstream schools. But on the other hand, it's children with intensive needs. The number of children in special education and institution never lowered down. So this is the situation so far, and what are now we are expecting the future challenges and what's ahead of us and what we really have to work it on. And this conference is supposed to open up this public discussion on this topic. It's on one hand, the priorities of the institutionalization for children are this to end this double-tier system of having institutional care for children with intensive needs and community services or care for children with less intensive needs. Another thing is the prevention of any kind of exclusion and restraint of children. So we have to do everything to stop any child to be excluded right from the beginning, because as Barbara already mentioned, once we exclude the child, it grows up into being an adult who is excluded. An important topic is also the development of foster care, specialized foster care, and support and training for foster parents, because we know children have to stay. It's different than adults. Children belong to the families or family-like environments. And the changing or conversion of institutions. And another important topic should be the development of networks of services for children in the community. These networks should be coordinated and pluralized. So thank you very much for listening to me. I just wanted to say that the Institute for Social Protection has a special website where on deinstitutionalisation, where the PowerPoints of this conference and also the recording of it, you can look at it there a few days after this conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andreja. There have been some efforts in Slovenia for improving the status of children with special needs. I myself was involved in that in the previous mandate of the Slovenian Parliament when I was a deputy. I initiated the procedure for the adoption of the law on early treatment of children with special needs, and that law was also intended to intensify cooperation with between schools, kindergartens, especially kindergartens, social workers, and doctors. So this is one of the improvements, but of course we still have a lot of work to do in Slovenia, and I think the Institute for Social Protection Institute of the Republic of Slovenia is doing a great job in this field, and its expertise will be and is always helpful in this field. I myself also have an experience with children with twins with special needs, so I know how important this field is for the children and for their parents and for the society in general. So now we are moving on to our program, and I now have the privilege to invite our first panelist, Dr. Stela Grigoras from UNICEF Europe and Central Asia. Stela Grigoras is a child protection specialist. She has been with the UNICEF regional office since March 2018, supporting UNICEF country offices and the governments in the Europe and Central Asia to implement effective child care social services reforms. Currently, she coordinates the implementation of the European Commission's Phase 3 of the EU Child Guarantee Programme in a number of EU member states. In the period of 2016-2017, she worked as the Minister of Labour, Social Protection and Family, later the Minister of Health, Labour and Social Protection, leading the implementation of important reforms in child protection, child care, social protection, employment and healthcare. Between 1998 and 2016, she worked for the Every Child in the UK, designing and implementing large-scale reform projects in childcare, child protection, social protection in Moldova and beyond. Stela Grigoras is a medical doctor by profession, holds a PhD degree in sociology, and has undergone a number of international qualifications, including in social work. She will today present us a presentation on deinstitutionalisation and childcare reform in European Child Guarantee pilot countries. She will present us trends, lessons learned, and priority interventions. So, Dr. Stela Grigoras, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Jasna, for such a detailed presentation. So I hope that I will raise to your expectations. But just to start with, I really want to say that, you know, deinstitutionalization is my passion, and I've been doing that for the last 30 years almost. And I really believe that, you know, all of the countries, especially EU countries, you know, they have to finish this transition. So now is the right time, especially now that it's a unique opportunity within the EU, with the, European Child Guarantee. This is such a unique opportunity for all of the children to start enjoying their rights within the families and the communities. And I really believe that Slovenia is going to make a big step now to finalize this transition. So you've been doing so great so far. And I think that now you need to make the last mile, yes, in order to reach out to all of the children that are not yet in families, that are not yet in communities, are not yet included in mainstream education, healthcare, etc. So I actually, before going into what the Child Guarantee does and the pilot countries, I really want to share with you a little bit of what we've been doing together with Eurochild recently in the last 2 years, and we call it the project that we call it Data Care Project. And we started this project a couple of years ago, just and we really wanted to have a very good timing with the European Child Guarantee, because we really want the European Child Guarantee to also to reflect these priorities in many of the EU countries in relation to deinstitutionalization, child care reform. So we've seen, in the recent years that EU is really committed, yes, to deinstitutionalization and to transition to family and community-based care. But at the same time, we've seen that there is a lack of reporting obligations, and there is no one unified, let's say, monitoring indicator framework that can be used at the EU level, but also by all of the member states. And as a result, what we have seen is that there is lack of comparable data across the member states. So we designed this project and we looked into the data systems in the 20 European countries, including UK, because UK was still, on the radar at that point in time. And we looked, and the project really wanted to understand more what are the national indicator framework and data system that's producing data on alternative care in the member states. What are the factors that impede or that are furthering the data quality and comparability, and also to explore opportunities for these indicators on alternative care, on child care, to be included in the EU-wide national framework that will produce quality and comparable data. So the project has finished and we have launched the report, so you can find it, it's everywhere now. But what the key findings are that all of the member states collect data on children, on stock especially, so meaning children that are on alternative care at a specific point in time. Many countries collect data that can be grouped mainly into groups of care, and this is residential versus family-based care. We also learned that much more data is collected and published. There is a wealth of administrative data that is not being published, and as a result, not really being used for policy design purposes. And also, but there was a very big interest in data reform. So 19 out of 28 countries surveyed that they have reformed their data care system or they are planning to reform their data care systems. What we've seen across the 28 countries, that there are four indicators that can be states and also at the EU level. So all of the member states, they have, they collect data about the total number of children in alternative care, as I said, residential care versus family-based care. Another indicator that is very important to show the, let's say, the progress of the reform is the percentage of children under 18 years of, from 0 to 17 that are in residential care at a specific point in time. From the total number of children that are in alternative care. That shows, what is the priority really for that country. And then three indicators that show the rate of children in alternative care, rate of children in residential care, and rate of children in formally based care. Very, very briefly, I will show you what is the data across EU. So you can see that now, at the moment, there are over 300,000 children in residential care in EU. And this, I have to say, is quite comparable with the rest of Europe and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So EU is doing better, but not very much. So there is still space for the EU to really complete the transition. So I'll have two slides showing, where different countries are. On this slide, you can see, for example, that Cyprus and Greece, they are doing the best among this cohort of countries in terms of the rate of children in family-based care and residential care and overall in alternative care. Here you can see also Slovenia in the other cohort of countries. And you can see that Slovenia is doing not bad. So not bad in terms of, the rates of children in residential care and formal care and in alternative care and in family-based care. But still, there is space, as I said earlier, for improvement. This indicator in terms of percentage shows that although, for example, Cyprus, yes, as I said earlier, and Greece, they were doing fine in terms of rate of children in the alternative care, family-based care, and residential care. But you can see that there are few countries like Cyprus, Greece, and Portugal that have high number of children in residential care from the total number of children in alternative care, which means that even if they have small numbers of children in care, the vast majority of them are in residential care, showing that family-based care is not really developed. Slovenia has 42% of children in residential care out of the total number of children. And you see that if you want to progress, there are countries that you can compare with Estonia and Malta and UK and Ireland that have a very small number of children in residential care. And when we say residential care, these countries also include small group home as residential care. And I wonder what is the definition for Slovenia of residential care, of the small group homes, for example, as well. So our project really recommended that we use these four indicators at the EU level and at the member state level, and that EU is developing this wide, is integrating those indicators in the existing, indicators framework, and using the child guarantee, for example, as an opportunity. We are working now at the moment with the Commission and the Social Protection Committee to integrate as many indicators as possible in order for the EU to be able to track progress, to compare progress between the countries, but also to invest more in finalizing the transition from institutional to family-based care. So everyone knows exactly why we need to deinstitutionalize, especially children. So it's already a wealth of data. We all know that family cannot be replaced with anything, even very good small group homes, because the families are so crucial in socializing, protective, economic, mediating, and nurturing functions. And as a result, it improves the developmental outcomes for children, which are in turn supportive of long-term human and social capital development. Yes, we all know that policymakers should develop policies that strengthen families. And we need a more comprehensive continuum of care that is really centered around the child and grounded in the best interest of the child. And that the policymakers develop policies that are transforming the childcare system and gradually eliminating the role of institutions and eliminating the existence of institutions as a whole. So we all know that, deinstitutionalization is not just, closing down institutions and removing children from institutions. It's really about very deep structural reforms that go beyond of this process of transition from institutional care. And for that, we definitely need political will. We've seen that without political will, institutional commitment, the ownership of the government, the transformation process can stop at any time of the progress and stagnate. That this is what we see in so many countries. So we need to revitalize this political will. We need a coordinated cross-government approach because it's not just about the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. We need reforms in all of the ministries, and we need budget and attitudes at all levels of government. Of course, we need a continuum of family and community-based services because children are so different. The needs are so different. We cannot have one or two responses to children's needs. We need the whole continuum of services. From prevention, early intervention, and to alternative care services. And of course, you've mentioned already in the opening speeches, we need universal services because I think that when the universal services fail, when we don't have inclusive educational services, when we don't have inclusive medical services, the need for institutions, the need for separations of children will always exist. And this is the continuum of care that we all agree already at the global level, that we really, the preferred goal of any policy should be, birth family. We need to support it, and it's easier and it's less expensive to really invest in the biological families of the children. And if, the child needs to be, separated, then we need to think about other family-based care. And we talk here about kinship care that is a priority, and then foster care and adoptive families. And only then we think about the small group homes, because small group homes, I have to say, it's still an institution. We call them family-like, family type, but that's not the home. It's not the family. It's still residential care. And it should exist in a comprehensive childcare system, but in a very small scale for very little number of children in institutional care, in alternative care. So, yes, I have 5 more minutes, but institutional care, we should, stop this because this is already a disgrace for the children that are still in institutional care. Oops. So, and I'm not, going into depth of that, but it's very important. Somebody has mentioned that Slovenia doesn't place children who are younger than 3 years of age into any place of in institutional care. I hope they don't even get placed in the small group home. But the EU practice is really recommending to increase this age. So they say at least 7-8 years of age, children should not be placed in any kind of institutional care. And that in general, residential care is not suitable. Permanent placement of children, even if the child is placed in a small group home, for example, it's not for the whole life. It should be very short term. It should be really focused on reintegration or on a permanent planning for this child and moving the child as soon as possible to a family-based care. What UNICEF is doing is really working across, in the EU, but also in other, countries like in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia, really to foster these childcare reforms. And we work at all of the 6 elements that you can see here of the childcare system. We support governments in helping them transitioning to family and community-based care. In terms of the European Child Guarantee, as I said, this is a unique opportunity, and we are implementing the Child Guarantee as phase 3, is a preparatory action for the European Commission in a number of countries. And in these 4 countries that you see here, Bulgaria, Croatia, Greece, and Italy, which have no big numbers of children in institutional care, but they still want to continue the transition. And what we are helping them is really to revise the policies and revise the legislation, to develop gatekeeping systems and mechanisms, to really restructure their structures in order to be able to deliver reform policies. And of course, we help them to put services in place and develop the social service workforce, and working on the inclusiveness of the universal services. And not in the last place is really to help government to reallocate the financial and human resources from residential to community-based care. For example, Bulgaria and Croatia, the focus is really on prevention, because they've done so much on closing down institutions and they're moving children outside of the institutions to family and community-based care. They focus on prevention, and we help them to develop outreach family support services, outreach multidisciplinary teams, to outreach to those that are still behind, that are left behind in this effort. So very often to Roma settlements, that's, because the number of children in these countries that are getting separated and placed in institutions are Roma. So while in Italy, for example, you've seen on the diagram maybe that where they need to really do more on diversified form of family-based care. So we're supporting them to develop, specialized foster care, especially for children with disabilities, to put in place different housing arrangements for children that are prepared to live care, but also for young people with disabilities. And we're putting in place, of course, family support services and different schemes for families to support each other, especially for children with disabilities. While in Greece, it's a more comprehensive approach, because the government really wanted to look again into the transformation of residential care. So we help them with the national policy development processes, and we are trying to really work with the support of our partner that is also present at this conference, George Nikolaidis, to really look at the 5 institutions. These children can move outside of those institutions, what services, what structures, what mechanisms we should put in place in order for those children to really benefit from their rights of being in the family. And in parallel, of course, we work on alternative care as well, helping the government to put in place better foster care services, to develop supervised independent living, including for young people with disabilities, and really to help people to transition from institutional care, residential care to community and family care. I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention. And it is, as I said, a great pleasure for me to be here, and really wish Slovenia success in the last effort to make the deinstitutionalization a full reality in Slovenia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, Dr. Grigoras. We are now moving on to the next presentation. So I am calling upon Dr. George Nikolaidis. He is the psychiatrist and the director of the Center for the Study and Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect in Greece. His scientific interests include public health sciences, epidemiology, health policy, methodologies of quality assessment of health services, epistemology, and philosophy of health sciences, philosophy of psychopathology, psychoanalytic theory, studies on the sciences, on the phenomena of violence and death, and research methodology. He has published several scientific monographs and articles in these fields. As a scientific coordinator or as main researcher, he has involved in various researchers, trainings, and clinical projects related to child protection, violence, and epidemiology. Since September 2005, he has been the head of the Department of Mental Health and Social Welfare at the Center for the Study of and head of the Department of Mental Health and Social Welfare of the Center for the Study and Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect of Institute of Child Health. In 2018, he was elected president of the Lanzarote Committee Nikolaidis will present a presentation on the practices of community care for children. So, Dr. Nikolaidis, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you also for the invitation of being here with you, with all these wonderful people. And I'm glad to also recognize among the audience and the participants a lot of good people with which we have collaborated and will still in collaboration, like Stella, just spoken, but also other people like Petra and Bisser and other good colleagues. Now, I'm going to share a few thoughts about the quest for deinstitutionalization, as I have experienced this working here in this country, in Greece, but also try to outline the wider context in which this is unfolded. So I will try to share my presentation. Yes. Since I also, according to the agenda, I have another intervention in part B of the online conference. If some of the things that I will present here could be more elaborated in detail in the second part of this conference. So I'll try to make the presentation in the slideshow, but just because lately Zoom has some issues, just notify me if the slides are going one after the other or if they have stopped in the first one. Are they moving?
No, they're not.
No. So I'm afraid we will have to probably stay to this mode, if that's okay with you, because unfortunately I cannot fix this problem in my laptop maybe. So our pre-existing knowledge about the damaging effect of institutions and residential care, initially it was brought into the public attention by some notorious cases in institutions in Romania, Portugal, Turkey, Ireland, and many more countries. Usually, initially it was referred to old-fashioned, big, large number asylum-like institutions, but soon after that, it was discovered that this happens everywhere in all institutions, in small ones, in big ones, in modern ones, in old-fashioned ones, secular or religious ones, and so forth. It is to be found, of course, in higher frequency in same-sex institutions, detention or correctional or reformative facilities, and in institutions for children with disabilities or for migrant or street children. But of course, this is not excluded only to this type of institutions. Especially in regards to children with disability, it seems that we have higher rates of victimization of those children in residential care facilities. We will speak about that in a minute. According to UNICEF's international global reviews, any child that is being placed in a residential care facility has a high probability of being victimized, even only by peer children with which the child resides with. So roughly a child, once it has been placed in an institution, has 85% possibilities of being physically perpetrated by other children with which the child lives with, and 25 to 30% chance of being sexually perpetrated by other children. And apart from that, of course, we have incidents, multiple incidents of victimization of children from personnel, volunteers, managers, other people involved in institutional life. But also there is another kind of victimization of children in institution, and that is the systemic victimization which the children are subjected to once they've been placed in an institution. There is physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, connected with the way an institution works. There is program abuse, and there is an overall systematic abuse of violation of individual rights of children living in institution. We have a compiling body of evidence from empirical research around the globe for more than 50 years now that institutions inflict harm to children that they are being placed to. Probably the most prominent of those is the disinhibited attachment, the inability of these children growing up in institution to be able to make an attachment with other people once as they grow up. But also we have quasi-autistic syndromes, speech disorders, behavioral disorders, personality disorders, other psychosocial, educational failures, a low performance in professional life. The literature is huge. I would just mention a few of the research that has been conducted. We know from, especially from the case of Romania, in which there were several studies that documented the harmful effect of institution to children. We also know that especially for infants and toddlers, placing them in residential care is causing irreversible damage. And this can also be traced by MRI, functional MRI techniques in those children's brains. And that was the reason why the United Nations, almost 20 years ago, has issued a global recommendation to all parties to stop placing children under 3 in institutional residential care, because we know that after that, there's no way that this harmful effect can be reversed to normality. One additional concern is that usually children placed in care in general are not the average children. They are already victimized, and some of them are belonging to the category termed by Professor Fingerhor as poly-victimized children. So these children have been subjected to multiple different types of victimization throughout their childhood. And when we're placing them in an institution, we are subjecting them to additional victimization experiences. And that makes those children being subjected to violence and victimization before, during, and after being placed in an institution. That all the aforementioned issues and concerns were the grounds from which several international organizations have issued statements and recommendations to parties, countries, stakeholders, agencies, organizations to intensify their efforts to deinstitutionalize the system of childcare. And just to mention a few, Council of Europe has been very active on that with the 2005 recommendation of the Committee of Ministers, but also United Nations guidelines for the alternative care of children and European Commission recommendation and so forth. And just to mention a few more recent examples, in the Lanzarote Committee of Council of Europe, in which, as it was mentioned, I was chairing, we issued in 2019 a declaration on protecting the rights of children that are being placed in out-of-home placement, highlighting the fact that there should be any effort for prioritizing family placement or family-like placement like foster care instead of placing children to an institution. A similar decision by the UN General Assembly on the anniversary of 30 years since the adoption of the CRC in 2019, and also recently Council of Europe has issued a visibility study on the rights, on the protection of rights of children in out-of-home placement within the context of the steering committee for the rights of the child. Now, I will turn now to the specific issue of children with disability and their rights and the violation of their rights once they are placed in institutions. We know that in general, persons with disability have 4 times more chance of being subjected to violence compared to the general population. That equally applies and even multiplied in children with disability. We know that statistically 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls with disability will be victims of sexual abuse before the age of 18. Children with disability have a 10 times higher possibility of being subjected to sexual violence compared to the general population. And we know that not only children with disability are being subjected more to violence incidents, but also we know that they have very, very limited possibility of getting help, of being believed at, of authorities intervening in order to provide them with protection and punishing the perpetrators. In one study, around 71% of the cases were reported not to be disclosed to anyone ever. 85% of them will never be reported to authorities. And from those, less than 1% will be dealt with by juridical authorities. So you understand here that children with disability not only are being subjected to an additional burden of victimization, but they rarely get any help and protection from any kind of service, law, enforcement, juridical authorities around the globe. And that's pretty much constant all over the world. And on top of that, the vast majority of perpetrators for children with disability are either parents, relatives, caregivers. 44% of perpetrators in one study were reported to be professional caregivers. In overall, more than 98% of perpetrators were within the circle of trust of the child with disability. That means that there's a close relation of the perpetrator with the child victim, and that makes disclosure more difficult and also intervention very, very difficult and causing additional issues to the child victim. And these are all reasons why we should abolish institutional placement of children with disabilities even more than in general for the children's population. And given that, nowadays the state of mind and the international community moves towards other types of care and placement for children with disabilities, with emphasis on training on any kind of caregiver, parents, other people involved, professionals that are involved in caregiving, in order for breaking down the circle, the vicious circle of violence that seems to be recycling through institutional care in children with disabilities. Now I will dedicate, if I have 5 more minutes, have I? I will, no? Oh, yes. I have 5 more minutes to, or
Andreja, take care so that
Yeah, you can take 4 more minutes, George. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Just to present in a nutshell the Greek experience, and I will continue with that in part 2 in the afternoon session. Now, in Greece, we have large size of residential care institution. Practically, unfortunately, still care for children is only institutional, or at its most institutional. 1/3 is run by the state, roughly 1/3 by big providers, and 1/3 by small, multiplicity of small private providers. Many of them are faith-based, but other secular as well, with limited resources and qualifications, standards of operation, and with fragmentation in community-based services. We have no data, and I will challenge what Stella just mentioned about the data in Greece. A colleague of mine working in childcare data once said in a conference, if you torture data hard enough, they will confess to anything. another issue, which is reliability of data, especially those provided by governments and the institutional sector. In one research, relatively recent, we found that there are still in Greece a little less than 200 infants and toddlers still being placed in institutional care. There are 800 persons with disability placed in, which are adults, but they are still placed in children's institutions because they have nowhere to go. And unfortunately, over time, the image is not yet changed. And of course, there was a notorious case of an institution for children with disabilities in Western Greece, in Lechena, in which children were placed in wooden cages, 2 by 2 by 1 meters. They were fed there. They were changed diapers there. We found one person who has stayed for 22 consequent years in a wooden cage like that without exiting the cage, not even 1 minute. That was located in a rural place outside a village, in a peculiar building from architectural point of view, which was a block of flats with a church built on top of it. In that institutions, 51 residents lived. By that time, we began the intervention with 58 permanent staff and almost €1.5 million as annual budget dedicated for the function of this institution. We collected data and we show that a good proportion of the discharges in the previous 5 years since the time we began the intervention there died out of respiratory failure, and that was connected to the poor feeding practices that prevailed in the institution. They were feeding the residents while the residents were lying down with processed food, and that caused them multiple pneumonias, which resulted in the deaths in due time. More than half of the residents were permanently restrained. And of course, some of them almost half of them had some contact with family members, but the placement over there, which is quite a journey from other parts of Greece to go there, really make it hard for these visitations to be more frequent or to work with these relations with relatives. The care was totally unsuitable. As you can see in those pictures, there were people tied up, hands and legs wounded by the belts, people fed there, people being permanently tied in their 4 hands and legs. And of course, there was total lack of any kind of stimulation because nothing really went on over there. We found unbelievable stories there. 2 sisters diagnosed, one with autism and one with mental disability, which were admitted in the care system when they were 4 years old. And for years in the previous institutions that they have resided, they interacted very much with one another. And when we got to this institution, we found them being placed in different cages, in different rooms, having to see one another for 10 years. We have found one 40-year-old resident with Down syndrome, which this institution, but also a previous institution in which that person was residing when it was a minor, both governmental institutions, hided the existence of this child from his own mother. The father has made a conspiracy with the institution management, and they placed an order, only communication to be directed to the professional phone of the father, and the mother did not knew that she had a son growing in an institution for 40 years. The medical treatment provided there was also often outrageous. There were people taking 7 different neuroleptics, plus 3 different mood stabilizers, plus anxiolytics, all in dosages 4 to 5 times up the upper therapeutic daily doses. And as a result of that, when we untied one person, she couldn't hold her neck up high because of the sedation from the heavy medication. So that was the reality we have found, and maybe I can continue in the next session on what we have done finding this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nikolaidis, for your interesting and at the end disturbing presentation. We all hope that things are improving, and of course they are, and all those institutions monitoring the situation can and hopefully will help preventing such things to happen in the future. We are now moving on to the discussion in our conference. The chairperson for the discussion will be Nick Crosby, the director at Gather, Build, Work. I am now calling upon him to chair the discussion, but prior to chairing the discussion, I will just shortly present Mr. Nick Crosby. As I said, Nick Crosby is a director at Gather, Build, Work. Prior to that, he worked in a number of different organizations in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. Between 2006 and 2016, he led the project on personal care and individual financing for children, youth, and adults in the organization In Control, where he held the position of director in the field of youth. His work in this area has fueled changes in national policies, foundation for individualized funding for education and health care for children and young people. Nick Crosby's main area of activity is the development and modification of existing services for children and young people with complex support needs. He has worked intensively with local decision makers in Scotland to develop individualized aid packages. His work is a combination of work directly with young people and working with national decision makers and organizations. So lots of experience in practice as well as in theory. So Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to be part of this today. We're quite tight on time because we've got so many good speakers sharing their really important information. So this session is going to be quite short. And what we'd like to do is to invite everybody to use the chat box to send in questions. It also means that you don't have to rely on having English as well. So please send in as many questions as you can. We are going to save the chat, and we'll follow up where we can after the session so that we can make good use of this time. The questions that we're thinking about would be questions for George, for Stella, for Andrea, for Andre, and for Barbara, if everybody's still here, and a chance for you to ask them about some of the things you may have heard, or some of the things that may be important in your day-to-day work. If you want to raise your hand, then we will invite you forward to speak. And I know that I've got support around translation as well, because there's some familiar heads that are along the top of my screen that have helped me in the past. So if people have got questions, please do send them in. I'm thinking that maybe it might be, I can't see any hands gone up yet. So I'm thinking that probably the way to do this is, and I'm not seeing any questions coming in, is to ask, if I started with Stella, I really enjoyed your presentation about the different parts and how the continued. Could you just be a bit clearer about the difference that you see between small scale group homes and institutions? Because I think that's something that can be quite puzzling for some of us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick, for the question. Yes, and I think that's we've been, as UNICEF a couple of years ago, have developed a white paper on the role of the small group home as part of the childcare system, and with a group of experts from around the globe, we really wanted to see what is the small group home, what is the definition of the small group home, and when we can apply small group home as part of the childcare system. So all of the experts, they came to the conclusion that, first of all, small group home is a residential facility. So it's a small scale residential facility. It's organized in, for a smaller number of children versus institutional care, where you have usually, a bigger number of children. It's around, the best practice shows that in advanced countries like UK, for example, or Ireland, the biggest small group home would be maximum for 4, 5, 6 children. So the number of children matters, because the very distinct, let's say, feature of the institutional care is the institutional culture. So the bigger number is the likelihood of having a real institutional culture in a facility is higher. Yeah. So we believe that the number counts, but of course it is also the quality of the care that is provided to the children. So usually, in small group home, the staff has the opportunity to provide better care. So the whole, the care is focused around the child, and it's not around the staff or the needs of the staff. It is around the needs of the children. First of all, that this is very much short term. So small group home cannot be, it's not a home, as I said, it's a residential facility that should be used for very small number of children, for very specialized needs, and for very short period of time. With the goal from the very beginning, from the first day when the child is placed in the small group home, that the child should be prepared for integration or for placement, or for adoption or for long-term foster care. So unfortunately, what we see in many countries of Europe, but also Central Asia, we have, first of all, large small group homes. Governments tend to call them family-like, family type, just to cover for those being institutions. Secondly, children are placed, even in countries like Bulgaria, we've seen, children are placed there as an end result. So they dismantle big institutions, they place children in small group home, and then these children are forgotten. So that's the biggest mistake that governments do. They should use small group home only as a transition. And they've unfortunately used those for children with disabilities, because they really needed to take those children from awful institutions. We understand that the need that was at that time, but now many of the governments should really go back to the small group home system and start doing deinstitutionalization as they've done for the big institutions. Yeah. So they need really to understand who the population of children is, what their needs are, and to really develop individual plans for all of these children to move out from this small group home. And I really wish to have less and less small group home. It's an option as part of the system. Of course, if you read the, general comment number 5 of the CRPD, they would say that no residential care should be applied for anyone, for any children, with disability or without disability. But unfortunately, the reality is like that sometimes we need a very short, residential placement as one of the options. But I think it's important that it is very temporary, very specialized, and for very limited number of children. So that's in very simple words, how would we define the small group home versus institutional care?
Thank you. Yes, I work alongside quite some very complicated children, and sometimes it's not safe for them to live in a family home. And so there is a space for very family-centered or child-centered homes. So I understand that the continuum, I think it's just important that we make sure that institutions aren't part of them. George, I have a question for you. It's really about the recovery, where you've managed, or where the people that you've been working with have managed to support a child or a young person or a young adult out of an institution. Could you just briefly talk about the process of recovering and getting used to living in the community?
Well, we see children thrive once they are placed in a community environment, in a family, and they are taken away from institution. I can recall quite some stories of children with or without disabilities that once they were placed in a family, they developed skills that were not visible by most of the professionals engaged with this child. For instance, I can recall a child which was found at the age of 2 inside a rural residence with his dead grandfather, who has been dead for almost a week, and the child could not even utter words. And the child was placed in an institution, and everybody was convinced that this child had a mental retardation because it seemed incapable of using language as a system of communication. But once it was placed in a family and you could provide that child with therapeutic assistance as well, it literally thrived. And it was a great shock for many professions who have just stayed in the static image of the child once it was in the institution, to see the child unfolding and having school performance getting better, linguistic skills that they couldn't imagine, and so forth. The same equally applies for children with disabilities. We have seen children that were labeled as very, very severe, severely retarded, or with severe autism, and once they are placed in a family, they began to interact, they advance their communication skills. And it has been a surprise, a pleasant surprise for me, working in, for instance, in the Lechina institution, but in other institutions as well, that any kind of potential threats in the process that we read in literature, and when beginning this effort, one naturally is afraid of, I've never encountered such threats. It's amazing how easily they adapt to the family environment.
Thank you, George. I think that the word thrive is really important. I think it's such a good word to describe what happens when children are given a chance to live in a family home and alongside their peers. We're starting to get some questions just as we're running out of time on the discussion. There's one for Andreja from a couple of people, and then there's one to George and Stella. George and Stella, if there was one thing that influences successful DI, what would that one thing be? Really briefly, one thing. Or one thing that's really important. Go for it, George.
I would say duration and strength.
Yeah.
The institutionalization is not a quick win. Yeah. It's something that you can endure multiple frustrations and be there and keep on pushing the agenda until it gets somewhere. And I would say that the continuation and the permanency of this kind of pressure is the most important factor.
Thank you. And Stella?
I would say, and I think I said that's also in my presentation, everything starts with political commitment. If the government doesn't want, nothing will happen. So, and I've seen in my current work, in my current capacity, you know, in countries that finished the transition in 1 year, 2 years time, Northern Macedonia, for example, because there was a strong commitment on behalf of the Minister of Labor and Social Protection, and they've established a very effective cross-sectoral mechanisms, and everyone was really involved in the process. And they've closed institutions for all children in Northern Macedonia. So this is possible, but the government should be very clear, should be very transparent about the intention, and really, really support the process. And then the government will see there will be many other actors coming in with the support and with different, you know, things to help this goal to come through in not 100 years, but in less time, because children unfortunately cannot wait. So that's what we have to keep in mind. We cannot say that we left those children behind because we don't have the capacity for now. No, we can't afford, even one child to be left behind. So we really need to finish the transition and to do the last mile in all of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good hearing the word Macedonia come up, Stella, because I'm aware that there's a few colleagues in the room and on this call who. There's a question for you, Andreja. Could you just explain a bit more about the double track that you were talking about?
Yeah, it's quite similar to that Stella's PowerPoint presentation, where she crossed out institutions. Until we will have institutions, we will have to invest in them. In Slovenia, it is quite a rich country, but not so rich that can afford to sustain both systems, to improve institutions and invest in them and developing community-based services. So definitely this system has to be abolished. We need to have a continuum of community-based care without any more investment in institutions or care for children in them. And that's basically what also costs, not just it's not ethical and non-professional to keep these institutions, but having this double-tier system costs us a lot of money. Yeah. In Slovenia, when we were counting the numbers for adults and children in social care, we counted that we waste every year at least 2.2 million per year to keep just this double-tier system, which could be invested in community care. If we did it quickly, like they did it in Macedonia, these costs wouldn't be there and we would be able to afford all this money to put in better community services for children.
Thank you, Andreja. One last question from Barbara to George. It's a question about when you were talking about the experiences in Lechia. How did staff respond when you started shining a light on actually what they were doing wasn't appropriate, it was abusive?
Well, I will invite everyone to stay with us for the second part, because I will speak about that in more detail. It wasn't easy, and in overall, no one of the conflicting sides won. I would say the truth, but it's still going on. It's not an easy thing. You always have resistances, and from where you least expect them to emerge.
Yeah. Thank you very much, George. I'm going to hand back to Jasna to take us into the next part of the discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Nick. So we are now in the next part of the discussion, as you said, and in this part, I would like to invite Mr. Bisser Spirov and Petra Kachirkova. I hope I've pronounced the last name of Petra Kachirkova properly, to present us national strategy for transformation of the care system in Bulgaria. Just before starting, please let me just introduce the two of you. Petra Kachirkova is the director of the Czech branch of Lumos and has been its leader since its establishment in 2008. She is a member of the International Advocacy and Training team, the member of the Government Committee for the Rights of the Child and in the Czech Republic. Bisser Spirov is a senior technical advisor and representative of Bulgaria in the Lumos organization. Prior to that, he served as the director of the Lumos branch in Bulgaria. He dedicated his career to end the systematic institutionalization of children and joined Lumos to support the process of transforming care in Bulgaria, advocating for children's rights. He conducts trainings in the field of deinstitutionalisation and children's rights, is a researcher, and together with his colleagues provides methodological support in the transformation of the children's care system. So please, colleagues, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for this invitation. I'm very glad to participate in this very interesting and significant conference. We divide our presentation in two parts. This part, I will present the experience from Bulgaria, and in the afternoon part, my colleague Petra will present some more general promising practices related to DI. So I will share my screen now with a short presentation. So as we just were presented very nicely, I'm one of the Lumos senior technical advisor. I'm based in Bulgaria. I'm Bulgarian. Lumos, just few words for Lumos. Lumos is an international organization who fights for every child's right to live and grow up in safe and loving families. We know that children need families. We believe that families can stay together, and we are working to prevent unnecessarily separation of children from their families. And actually, we want to see a world without orphanages or any other kind of specialized institutions. I have worked for over 25 years in the childcare system in Bulgaria. I start as an educator, we call it in this with this word, the professionals who work in homes for children. So I start my career in Home for Children in Sofia, one specialized institution, and later, I became a national consultant for development of alternative services in Bulgaria, which support children to live in their families and communities. And I'm very glad and proud that as Lumos representative, last 10 years, I took part in the work regarding a holistic transformation of the child care system in Bulgaria, supporting the implementation of one very important strategical document of Bulgarian government, vision for the institutionalization of children in Bulgaria. Before to present some of the main components of this strategical document, I want to say a few words for Bulgaria. As you probably know, Bulgaria was a communistic country from 1944 till 1989. And there is one, regarding childcare system, there is one very, very simple and very significant fact. Before the communistic period, we had 25 specialized institutions for children, orphanages. 45 years later, we had almost 360 specialized institutions in Bulgaria. In a way, communism led to a very large increase of specialized institution and institutionalized children in Bulgaria. More than 35,000 children we had at the end of the communistic period. And right after the changes in 1989, the question of the harmful effect of the institutionalization towards child's development began to be discussed. And there were a lot of working groups, international projects, international experts. And in 2000, we actually achieved very significant result. We create actually our child protection system. We change our legislation with Child Protection Act. We plan some measures for vulnerable children, and the child protection department were placed in every town in Bulgaria. And from that moment, the institutionalization and transformation of the system was possible. And for 10 years, there was significant decrease of children placed in institution. You see that almost 50% from children in institution were decreased in this period from 2000 till 2010 or 9. But one of the imperfections of this reform process was that the number of the specialized institution decreased not in correlation with the number of the children. So you see that between 10 and 20% of the institution were closed, the rest they exist. And why I call this imperfection? Because the focus on this time was on the easy cases. All these easy cases were easily moved out of institutions. But this means that most vulnerable children with very complex needs, with severe disability, stayed in the homes, and very often children with severe disabilities or challenging behavior were moved and replaced from one home to another, better one. And at the end, in 2010, we had very high mortality in specialized institutions. We had a lot of very difficult cases with severe disabilities and challenging behavior. And you see that specialized institutions continue to prevail as a main form of care for vulnerable children. And then the new strategy was developed. And this is very important, that one of the aim of this vision for the institutionalization of children in Bulgaria was not to close only the bad homes, but to close all the institutions, all specialized institutions. In that moment, they were 137. But not only this, together with this, to improve the existing system by new and adjusting the existing legislation and development and design of new services. I would like to pay your attention to three very important considerations that lies on the bottom of this strategy for child transformation in Bulgaria. But I think they are important for every successful transformation of the child care system. So these three pillars are related with services, child-centered approach, and gatekeeping mechanism. So the services are very important because we are talking not just for transformation of the system, but for very specific transformation, such transformation that will decrease dependence of the system from residential care and big institution, and in the same time will increase the services that support children to live in their families and in the communities. And we know already from the 80 years of research is that the family is the best place, and vulnerable families with little support, they will be able to provide care for their children. That's why most of the services are directed to the families. But the second very important thing is child-centered approach on this reform. And it sounds very simple because the child has to be in the center, but when you try to implement this in the practice, it's not very simple. So I think that there are 5 very important components of this child-centered approach. And first, to have holistic assessment. So every child has to be assessed, but not only the child itself, but the family as well. And the most important is to assess the abilities of the families to raise the child in their own family. The second important thing is that all the closure of institution, and especially moving children into new placement, has to be done with plan. No child should be moved out of institution without an action plan made by the current carers, but also the future. It could be their own parents, the biological parents, the foster carers or adoptive, or some social workers or child carers. Moving children, as I mentioned, one of the imperfections of the system before this strategical document was that some children were moved from one institution to another, and moving children from one institution to another is not acceptable. It's not really DI. So for every child must be ensured family or family-like placement, and also to try to ensure that one change is enough from place to place very often, because this is very risky for the child. And child participation is very important. Children should be involved as much as possible in the process, especially in the process of making a decision or discussing future place of living and services. And I can assure that even children with disabilities, with more severe disabilities, with right approach could be involved in the lot of work related with their own life. And 5, last but not least, all children from institution must be provided with new placement, new accommodation in family and family-like services, and no child has to be left behind. Gatekeeping refers with the simple fact that you are not able to empty one sink if you don't stop the water that is filling the sink. So gatekeeping refers to systematic procedure aimed to ensure that alternative care for children is used only when it's necessary. And regarding the reforming of the system and deinstitutionalization, gatekeeping plays very important role, reducing placement of children in institution. And by this way, how to say, is allow one institution to be emptied and to be closed. But of course, this has to be accompanied and combined with intensive work to ensure alternative services, services for prevention of separation of children, and services for children who are already placed in the institution. Few words about the process, how this strategical document worked in Bulgaria. So the vision was very important document. I am completely agree with Stella that political will is very important. So this vision, this strategical document was done with participation of civil society, but it was political decision. It was political will to deinstitutionalize the system. But this document is not able to work on the field just because it exists. So it was necessary to implement the vision, to develop action plans for implementation of the vision. And the process of making action plans is extremely important, in my opinion, for 2 reasons. First, all projects that will be implemented later on the field will have one and the same common goal. There is a risk to have different projects, but actually not to achieve the goal of reforming the system. So the making action plan and DI project to be in accordance with the frame of this action plan is very important, because they will work to achieve the common goal. And the second part, second very important thing is that DI action plan is made with a lot of people. It's a very participatory approach. A lot of experts, service providers, representatives of institutions, also a lot of experts from NGO. And this is very important to achieve this complicated transformation of the system that we call the deinstitutionalization. But few things I would like to say for the management of all this process. We have 3 levels of management. The first level is this very high level steering committee from ministers, deputy ministers from all relevant ministries, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, Ministry of Healthcare, relevant agency for child protection, for social assistance, but also some other representative from the government. The second level of the management, which was very important, is the regional structures regional DI teams, and their main role was to guarantee that services will be developed and children who are part of this project will be prepared well to leave the institution in a safety way. So this project implementation unit, they were implemented on the different region, but every project has important project unit who was responsible for development of the strategies, communication, and implementation of the projects. I just want to pay your attention to this purple circle, expert working group, because the coordination between high level of authorities and this project implementation is very important. And sometimes authorities are not experts and they don't know really what's happened in the field. So this expert working group is with representative from expert, including expert from NGO, but also expert from the ministries. And this expert working group played the role of the monitoring body of the implementation of the process of transformation of the childcare system, and they bring the information from the lower level to the up level. Third important level is these regional teams who exist, and their main role was to ensure that all the children with disabilities or without disabilities, vulnerable children, will receive the services which they need in their own communities. Local coordinators were part of this, and their role was to guarantee that children in institution will have full assessment, will have plans for moving for transformation, and will be guaranteed for their rights will not be neglected. And last but not least, this was very important. A lot of effort was made to involve children and young people directly in the reform process. And this was very, very important because children with disabilities, at least in Bulgaria, I don't know how it's in Slovenia, but very often they are accepted as a subject of treatment. So object of treatment. So they are not asked. Professionals know everything. So their opinion is not very important. So this trial to include and to children and young people to participate in the process was a very significant part of the process. And what's happened actually for these 10 years, you see that specialized institution decreased. The number of the children is decreased more than 90%. We have only 2 institutions now, only 4 institutions, sorry. We have plans to be closed till the end of the year. Foster care developed a lot because in the beginning we had a few hundred children in foster families. Now we have a few thousand children in foster families. Small group homes also developed as alternative, but the most important, not residential services, community support services are very popular, and they are working with majority of vulnerable children and families. Last slide, I just want to pay attention to 3 very important things from our lessons learned. First, don't underestimate universal services because they are very important. In this process, we very often think for special services, for small group homes, for foster care, for some therapeutic centers, which are important, of course, but the role of universal services is also very important. Inclusive education, inclusive healthcare for all children with disabilities or with some other difficulties or challenging behavior. This is very important. Second is be very careful when you develop residential care services. We have a lot of small group homes, I think maybe too much for Bulgaria. And some of the small group homes in Bulgaria are functioning like a small-scale institution with 14 children, which is not small residential service. So it is good to avoid replication of institutional culture and institutional practices in new residential services. But one of the most important things related with the successful implementation of the strategy for transformation of childcare system is related with good communication and transparency. I think that even the resistance from the side of the staff in some of the institutions for children could be avoided with good communication and transparency. Communication, why we are doing this, what kind of services we need, why this is better for children, I think is very significant part of the whole strategy. Unfortunately, very often underestimated. Sorry, I was hurry, but I have only 15 minutes. I had more, but we will be happy to answer of all your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bisser, for your presentation. We really appreciate it because, as we said before, even if the government would have the will to implement the institutionalization, it would need a plan of transformation. This is a serious thing. It is not something you just make in a month. So your experience is really valuable also for Slovenia, and I hope in the discussion you will be able to exchange more experiences with. Now I'm calling upon Milan Šverepa, the Director of Inclusion. He will present his presentation on children's rights for all. But before giving you the floor, I will just shortly Mr. Milan Šverepa. He is a Director of Inclusion Europe, as I said, since 2016. In 2017 to 2019, he was a co-chair of the European Expert Group on the transition from institutional to community-based care. Before arriving at Inclusion Europe and Brussels, he worked on deinstitutionalisation and on planning of social care services in Czechia and other. So, Mr. Milan, please present your presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity to contribute to this interesting exchange on the institutionalization and children with disabilities. For Inclusion Europe, this, of course, is an incredibly important topic. So the institutionalization in general is one of our key areas that we work on and focus on. And as an organization representing people with intellectual disabilities and their families, it's one of our main priorities. And of course, there's nothing new to this conversation when I start by saying that institutionalization is a violation of rights, and that has been recognized both based on the CRPD disability rights framework and of course the children's rights framework, but also based on the Council of Europe framework of the Social Charter. There's a recent ruling on Czechia and institutionalization of children there, and that it is a violation of their rights and neglect to provide proper care for children and for families. And that's just to illustrate that we already have in Europe, I think especially, there is already a strong legal and policy background for the institutionalization. There are also many regions, municipalities that provide good inclusive support, including support so that children with disabilities can live in family environment and not being institutionalized. The problem with that so far children's rights are kind of a good practice lottery, and it very much depends on where one happens to be born or to live, whether that child or adult has access to the support and services they need, so that their inclusion and their rights are being respected. And that's, of course, not something that we can tolerate. Inclusion and the right to live in the community and the right to live within a family for children, they are a right, and that must be the norm for everybody in every society. It cannot be just based on somebody being lucky or unlucky to live in a region with a good practice, as we so often call them. Well, unfortunately, somehow quite a few governments still think that children with disabilities do not qualify as children. Somehow the children's rights do not apply to them equally, and the practices of the institutionalization do not apply to them equally either. That's been evidenced in many countries by leaving children with disabilities behind during the institutionalization efforts. We see that quite frequently, that even though there's a lot of work being done, and rightly so, to support children to not be institutionalized, this doesn't apply to children with disabilities, and they remain in institutions. Again, like most recent case of that would be Czechia, where they finally heroically decided to stop putting babies, children up to 3 years of age into institutions, but made an exemption of children with disabilities, and intend to continue doing so. So that, of course, is one very, very big area of concern when it comes to respecting the rights of children with disabilities in the institutionalization. And that is something that should be at the forefront of thinking for everybody when designing, planning, as was mentioned with the previous presentation, planning the services. Children with disabilities should be the first one. The planning is done for, the needs assessment is done for, support is being designed for them, so we avoid the situation I was just talking about. Another elements, of course, for the institutionalization of children with disabilities is ensuring that they don't end up in institution at any stage of their lives. And this includes providing early intervention to families, to babies from children from a very early age, so they get the proper support. This also includes providing a proper support in to families of children with disabilities during their whole of not just when they are very small, so that families can be families and not full-time carers, not administrators, not care coordinators. I think that's an issue with several countries where, and some of them I think were kind of presented here in one of the early presentations, where a lot of the support and care rests on families without any support from the state, and that is, of course, not a good situation from the families or for the children either. So support to families is a key component of the conversation of any plans to do the institutionalization. And then, of course, a brief mention to two other important topics, and one is course, access to education, especially access to mainstream education, so that children with disabilities can go to the same schools and get the same education as everyone else. Not only because it, of course, impacts their possibility to form relations and be part of their local community and all that stuff, but also because it impacts them for the long-term future in terms of being able to find jobs later in life, being qualified for what employers expect when it comes to it. And that brings me basically to my last point. When we talk about the institutionalization of children, it is very important, and from the look of how policies and decisions are often made not obvious to many, but children don't stay children forever. So there needs to be also reforms and changes to the whole system of support and services, not only for children, but for adults as well. Because otherwise, and we see that again in many countries, with a lot of investment, a lot of efforts, institutionalization of children may be avoided. Children with disabilities may be avoided when they are children, but they end up in institutions in adult age because there is a lack of support for them at let's say later stages of their life. And the same let's say applies to the legal reforms, especially around the right to decide about one's life, so legal capacity reforms and the establishment, the support to supported decision making. So overall, I tried in my presentation to add to your conversation some topics that from our point of view of representing people with intellectual disabilities are incredibly important when it comes to the institutionalization, and we see across Europe that they are often being forgotten or neglected. So again, the most important message from me would be that children with disabilities must institutionalization effort, because we often see that that is unfortunately not the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Now we are moving back to the discussion, so I will ask Mr. Crosby to take the floor again to see whether there are any questions. So please.
Thank you, Josna. Thanks, Bisser. Thanks, Milan. I think your presentations added to the earlier presentations, and it set things out really clearly, especially the kind of, this is the practical way and these are the rights. We mustn't ever forget the rights of the child and the rights of people with disabilities. One of the things that we wanted to do was to remind people that there's a strategy for DI or deinstitutionalisation being put together in Slovenia. And we'd invite people to add in the chat box things that they've heard this morning that they feel should be part of a future strategy for closure of institutions. So whilst people are answering questions, which you're very welcome to send in the chat box or put your hand up, we'd like very much for you to write the most important thing that you've heard down this morning, or something that's really, really important that you feel has to be part of a strategy in the future. So if you could start doing that, we'll do this very swiftly because I'm aware that time is running down and people probably are wanting to get a bite of lunch before the second part. Whilst people are adding in their thoughts, which I hope will come in quite soon, questions to Bisser and Milan. I'd start, here we go. Actually, we've got a question here. Here's a question for you, Bisser. How do you manage to include children, especially children with disabilities, as active participants? So what is it that the ways that Lumos has reached out to children and young people to make sure that their voices are heard in the process of closure and the process of planning their future and moving on.
Thank you for this question. This is very, very interesting, and it was not easy. And I can say that 100% of the children with disabilities were included in this process. What we as organization Lumos did, we start to work with a group of young self-advocates, we call. All of them are people with disabilities. Some of them still continue developed and continue to work as a self-advocate, participating in different events. But how we did? We try to first to advocate that the inclusion of the children is very, very important piece of the work. That when we are talking for the rights of the children, we have to include these children, their families, but mostly the children, and to try to hear their voice in the different steps in this process of deinstitutionalization. For example, the assessment forms which were developed included very significant part of this assessment form was with interaction with the children. So the children with disabilities, they had some role in these assessment forms. They have to talk, they have to, if they are not verbal, they have to be observed or to try to communicate with alternative forms. So it was not, we tried to avoid assessment to be done only on paper and only filling some forms. Then we had a very important meeting, so-called case conference, after the assessment, where there was this case conference are multidisciplinary meetings with representatives for different organizations to discuss what will be the best service, what will be the new place for living when the institution is closed, and we stimulate and support children with disabilities to take part in these meetings, and they really take part in these meetings. Of course, according to their level of disabilities, but they were supported, and it was maybe it sounds a little bit like something very normal, but it was not. Professionals accepted that children with disabilities, they don't understand. They can't take. They can't understand what we will talk about. It is not so important to be included, and I think that this was one of the most important steps to try not just to talk about this and to advocate on more higher level, but to try to include in the real practice steps that involve and children participate.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Milan, I'm very aware that self-advocacy is right at the heart of Inclusion Europe. So I'm wondering if you wanted to add to Bisser's comments around self-advocacy and the importance of self-advocates having a voice in the process. I mean, it's their life.
Well, I probably should, since it's at the heart of our, but I think you've just said it for me. So I will just reiterate, not to take too much time. Of course, supporting people to speak up for themselves and to get together and exchange on their experiences and support one another is an important element of the process. And this is maybe just something just to stress as well. It's not necessarily as in self-advocacy in this context, as in speaking up and talking about it, as a strong element of essentially a peer support as well, and sharing the experiences of somebody who's moved out of an institution, so they come and talk to others who are let's say at that stage. So there's definitely many roles that this and many forms that this can have, and it definitely needs to be a strong part of the planning and the process and the support that people receive. Yeah,
that's cool. That's cool. There's a question coming here. I think this one's directed towards you, Bisser. and the work of Lumos, and some of it you might well be talking about this afternoon, but it's around thinking about some of the challenges of supporting children, young people with really complicated support needs. And how did you manage to move away from locked wards or specialist units in a sense, and find better support for those children, yeah, with really complicated lives?
Well, this when I saw the pictures this morning from George Nikolaidis from this institution from Lahyana, it reminds me very strongly this very similar institution in Bulgaria where Lumos was very much involved, the Home for Children with Disability in Krušari. And I may say that even Lahyana was better because the cages were from wood and colored. In this home in Krušari, it was very old iron cages. Not really cages, but iron beds, and the level of neglection was very, very high. What we did, we know that moving children immediately or quickly is very risky because they were very vulnerable. They never go out of the cots. Not only from the building, but from the cot. So the small bed was there. They was living on this bed for 10, 15 years. So what we did, we started very purposeful work to stimulate these children and to increase their experience. We used intensive interaction because the communication was very, very neglected. These children were not communicated. They just were fed in the beds, and from time to time they were but not really to communicate with them. Nobody play with them. Nobody read a story or a book. So we start with these simple things, training the staff. We invest a lot of time and resources to train the staff, the carers in the institutions, even that we know that this is not very wise because the institution will be closed. But part of this staff is still working in the other services for children, but it takes years. I may say that this gradual process of preparation of these children to be moved safely took three years, and there was very intensive process of new staff, new workers, foster carers who take care for these children now, to be also included in these trainings and to be also prepared how to take care for these children and what are their needs.
Yeah. And it's about time and doing things at the child's pace.
Yes.
And that kind of goes back to the self-advocacy, doesn't it? It's about children being in the lead, really. It's their life. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm aware of time and that we're getting very close right to the end. But I've just got another question. And this one's for you, Milan. If you could point towards good examples where families have been involved in the planning of a new way forward, are there examples in different countries that Inclusion Europe works alongside that you would point to?
Well, on top of my head, it's hard to name a specific one, let's say, but also I don't believe that one size fits all in this sense. So yeah. I think it's just important to follow the steps. I think there's lots of good examples in different levels all over Europe. Essentially, the methodologies are there. No, sorry, I cannot kind of blanked out on this one, but I believe that there is plenty of stuff available to just follow the right step. And the most important element is to do it. And yes. The details and the specifics may vary, but let's just go into it, involve family, listen to the parents, listen to the children, and the siblings as well, and that's it. I think that's the most important part of it.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. It's about making sure it happens. That's the most important thing. Yeah. I hand back. I mean, my final comment is that all the work I do, I'm very clear that any child who's placed in an institution is a mark of failure, because if we get in and support the child at the right time in their life, then we won't fail the child, and the child won't end up in an institution. And I think it's a really clear message that we don't need to fail our children anymore. We can do better. But thinking about involving families, back to Jasna, and as chair to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. So I will, if you allow me, resume what we have learned today, just in some words. So we have learned that Slovenia is on the way to DI. It's a very long word. The word itself is difficult. If we think of the process, it's also a problematic thing. So we need to change the systemic level in Slovenia. We have to replace the two-track system Andreja talked about. So no financing, gradual decreasing of financing institutions, and more community care. We should prevent in Slovenia exclusion or restraining of children. Slovenia should develop foster care. We need coordination of network services for children. As we heard, I think it's very important to develop self-advocacy system, which would have to be developed more in Slovenia. In this context, it seemed important to me. And also, one important point was that coordinated cross-government approach is necessary. How to ensure this is not $1 million question, I think, but $1 billion question. It's always a problem to ensure this cross-government cooperation, but this would really be necessary. I agree with that. So the next conclusion would be that we need a transformation plan. It was a very good information, and I think it was very useful to hear what steps we would need on this transformation path if we take it, and it is necessary that we take it in Slovenia, as we see. Nothing will happen if there is no will at the government side to start the changes, to move on towards, to accelerate, if I may say, the path to the DI. And we saw that, we heard that victimization is, that children with special needs are more exposed to victimization. This is one of the general conclusions, but it should be taken into account when we when government thinks about accelerating the DI. One of the most important conclusions to my mind is also that children's rights apply also to children with special needs, but DI of children should be one of the most important goals, because DI starts with children. Because if we have children in institutions, then we will have more adult persons who will still be institutionalized. And for the end, it's a long process. it has always in every country been a long process which can't be ended in a month or even in a year. But we should also take that into account. But I think the conclusion is that the process of DI should be accelerated in Slovenia, and that expertise on how we should do it can be prepared by also by NGOs, experts in Slovenia, and also with the help of experts and other persons who have had similar experiences with DI in the EU, and mostly in the EU because we have the comparable systems. So you are free to add to my conclusions also in the chat. This is what I managed to sum up as I was listening to everyone. I hope I have managed to draw all the conclusions, but we can also include some more if all of you think that it is necessary. So if there are any I mean, this is now. I think we have come to the end of this first part of the conference, which was we are a little late, I think. So I hope the first part of the conference was useful for you, and that you have gained some information, and that you will be able to continue with your work wherever you are on that very important field, as it is important that all of us experts, government officials, wherever we are, social workers, really do our share and contribute to our effort that this process is continued and successfully finished, hopefully once in the future. Thank you all for your attention.